reflect those of WWDB, its staff, or management.
Welcome to Common Sense with your host, John Federico.
We don't need no education.
John will be taking your calls at 610-664-4100 to discuss headline issues that affect you, your family, and your community.
We don't need no thought control.
Call John at 610-664-4100 to sound off on topics and events that are important to you.
No dark sarcasm in the classroom.
Now, here's the host of Common Sense, John Federico.
Good morning. This is John Federico, and you're listening to Common Sense. The number to call in here at the station, if you want to comment on anything being said today or ask any questions during our live broadcast, is 610-664-4100. That's 610-664-4100. Excuse me. Yesterday, we were discussing, and I try to keep the program here based more on broad themes than on the day-to-day nonsense that goes on with our politicians and some of the things you hear in the press. A couple times I was told, hey, there's a breaking story about this or about that. In most cases, breaking stories are really just entertainment. By the time you find out what's really going on, it's quite different from the initial story. My broader theme was to look at ways that we can potentially change a system that is broken. And our American political system is broken. If it wasn't broken before 2008, it's extremely broken now. And when I think about changing the system, I go back and look at the people in the past who have tried to do something like this, and they were great men. I'm just talking on a radio here, but one of those men I've quoted on the program before is Thomas Paine, and Thomas Paine wrote a book called Common Sense, which is published in 1776. And at the very beginning, in the introduction, he says quite accurately that, and this is the biggest problem you have with the way government's able to influence us. You see, it says a long habit of not thinking something wrong gives it the superficial appearance of being right. And when we spoke yesterday about the precedents that are set by government, government is able to encroach on our freedoms and expand its power. And sometimes they'll use a sound argument for a momentary reason that they need to do such a thing. But once they've done it, they rarely give that power back. And that was a fear that the early founding fathers had, which is why they constructed the Constitution as a protection, not for the government against the people, but for the people to use that Constitution to protect them against the encroachments of government. And it's interesting because if you look at a lot of the things we've done in the past, like we talked yesterday about the bailouts. I mean, we started bailing companies out. There were bailouts going back to the beginning, but let's say, the early 70s when they really started getting heavily into bailing out. And bailing out, by definition, is public money going to shore up private enterprise. The first one that's on the screen that we looked at yesterday was Lockheed Martin, and the reason why, or Lockheed, I guess at the time, and the reason why Lockheed was bailed out was because it was a defense contractor, and then Penn Railroad was bailed out because they were fundamental for transportation and for military reasons to keep them running in case cases of war that we needed them, and we were in Vietnam at the time. So anyway, but they do these things so many times as an emergency measure or a one-time event. You kind of look at the way a politician is able to get a country to rally behind him for an unpopular measure, whatever that unpopular measure might be. And sometimes it's for a noble measure which is not popular, but many times it's for a measure that's dear to the heart of the politician, but quite unimportant to the people. You can go back and look at, if you want, go back and look at the sinking of the Maine during the preceding the Spanish-American War. History, we're taught in school now that the Maine really wasn't sunk by the Spanish. But the administration, and particularly Theodore Roosevelt at the time, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, they really wanted to go to war. They wanted to take the last couple of Spanish possessions. They knew Spain was weak and needed an excuse to go to war. But the people weren't interested in going to war. But the people wanted to defend their pride. So they blew up this story about the Maine. And I think a lot of politicians of the 20th century learned from that event. Though when they sunk the German U-boat sunk, I guess it was the Lusitania, I think it was probably 1915. I don't remember exactly, 1915, before World War I. Wilson could have, before the U.S. ended World War I, the Allied powers of France and Britain were already taking on the Axis, which was Germany, or Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they didn't enter the war because at the time the administration was anti-war. They could have easily used that as a means to go to war. In fact, Wilson, if I remember correctly, ran in 1916 for his re-election on the condition that he would keep he kept America out of war, would keep our boys from going to foreign shores, and that's what he ran on. That was 1916. Then, of course, 1917 we went to war, and we went to war at the time. I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, the event that caused us to get into World War I that rallied the people was a Zimmerman telegraph or something. Zimmerman telegraph that. I think the Germans sent a message to the Mexicans that in the event of war, if they would side with the Germans, they would give them back. Believe it or not, I think it was Arizona, Texas, and part of the Southeast, and they would financially support the Mexicans. Of course, that got the Americans very upset, and they declared war on the Axis powers. So it was another event, just like they say, roll forward to World War II. Franklin Roosevelt, after socializing most of the nation and still keeping us in a depression from, I guess he got in office in 33 until at that point it was 41, plenty of time to get us out of the depression, just kept making it worse. And then World War I was raging in Europe, and the U.S., he wanted to get the U.S. in. We had already built up our defense industry by providing armaments to the British under Lend-Lease. A lot of people today, and there's been books out on this, said that he knew in advance of the Pearl Harbor attacks. He sent the carriers away. He let Pearl Harbor be bombed and people die in order to get the event that we needed to get us into World War II. So, you look at the way the government is able to get people behind its measures by manipulating the current events. So sometimes looking at current events, unfortunately, when you look at them in the current time, it's very hard to gauge what actually is going on. When I look at a lot of the problems we have today, you would think there would be obvious things that a decent human being would do before he entered a debate, whether he's a politician or a private citizen. And when we first started, I guess the administration first started going after Goldman Sachs, and you can look this up online anywhere. A lot of money from Goldman Sachs and the other investment banks went to the Obama administration, along with the Republicans. You would think the first thing Mr. Obama would say was, okay, we're going to prosecute these people. I made a mistake taking their money. I represent the interests of the American people. I want to make my hands clean. I'm going to give back the money. He could do that with British Petroleum, too, where he took almost $1 million. Say, okay, we have problems. They didn't buy me off. I'm going to give them their money back. Here's the money that they gave me. But you don't hear any politician, just like they don't give power back, they never give money back. I mean, they have to be completely gilded into it. And you'd think the amount of money he's collected, $1 million would be easy to give back, but he'll never give it back. It would be nice to see it. It would be something I actually could support and say, wow, what an interesting character. He actually did something that another politician hasn't done before. In fact, I'm waiting for a current politician to do something novel. I'm waiting for a current politician to break from the mold, to say, I'm different from these people. I'm not going to do it this way anymore. But you don't see that. And you don't see that because of the system we're in. These people manage to get into politics and get to the positions they are by playing by a certain set of rules. And that set of rules excludes the power of the people. It's almost entirely the power of the party and the power of special interests. The special interests might be large groups of citizens sometimes, which would seem to be something we should support, but many times those interests are not being properly represented by their own leaders, whether they be union leaders or whether they be leaders in any other capacity. They're not necessarily being representing the people, they're representing their own selfish interests. So anyway, when you look back in history, you see that men at the time had a difficult time persuading people to get behind their even if they're trying to improve life, to get them behind the measure. It was very difficult to do. So we were talking also yesterday about as we do quite often, about the banking crisis and the bailout, and it seems improper perhaps to whine about something that already took place. But I want to just hit on that one more time because I was speaking to a banker yesterday, and he mentioned that the bailout was was necessary, and he started to list reasons why the private sector needed to keep liquidity. Because if you're a large bank and you're lending to a large or a small company and you have an open credit line, and all of a sudden you no longer exist as a bank, that company can't borrow the money, and then all of a sudden they're in trouble. So he mentioned that, and I said to him, "Well, that's very interesting, but it seems to be that they could put it into a receivership. They could put the bank into a receivership and still keep those lines extended where proper." I just was concerned with the manner they went about the bailout. So we went back and forth on it, and talked about the reasons why a bailout would be necessary at all, or not a bailout. The reason why you'd want to establish calm in the market would be necessary. And we ran across 3 or 4 items. But we have a caller right now, so I'm going to take that caller before we continue talking about the banking. The caller's name is Bruce, and he's calling, it says, from Trenton. Good morning, Bruce.
Good morning, John. How are you?
Not bad. How are you?
Good, good. I was listening. I heard your show yesterday, even though I didn't call. So many topics.
Yeah, one of the things that's been mentioned to me is that I move from topic to topic so quickly that a caller doesn't have a chance to call in about a certain topic because I'm already talking about the next topic.
Well, the banking. I mean, practically every, part of the problem we have is it's just hard to get candidates. I mean, I found that myself. I've had ads in the paper, sign in front of my store. People say, "Yeah, I'd like to have a third choice. Yeah, I agree with what you're saying." And then I say, "Would you like to be a candidate?" And they say, "Well, I got to go now. I'll see you. Bye."
Yeah, because they're probably busy, making their own income for their own lives, and don't have the energy or the time or the money to sacrifice.
They think if they work harder, that somehow they can survive. And what they don't realize is that the government just simply raises the taxes and destroys the economy even more, which the government has been doing for the past 50 or 60 years, and it's led us to where we are today.
And Bruce, there's so many examples. You can go in the world if you want to study them where you have low taxation. There's a story in Sovereign Report that I get that talks about bankers going to Hong Kong back 35 years ago, and they were in Canton, and then they went to Hong Kong. And in Canton, there was poverty everywhere. You had an administration that ran the country that had basically socialized everything, and there was nobody could feed themselves, but they were all somehow provided for. On the other side, you have Hong Kong that was being run as a capitalist enclave, and they had very low taxation. They had a very little safety net. Hardly anybody, if anybody at all, was starving or unprovided for, and yet the government was almost absent from the day-to-day life. And there's
no substitute for work.
I agree.
I have people come in my store like this, and a lot of them are on disability. I say, "What's wrong with you?" They say, "Well, I have panic attacks, and I can see they're overweight, and I know enough about food and the ramifications of food. If they eat too many carbs, they have panic attacks, they gain weight, and the government just puts them on disability, and now you and I have to pay for them so they can sit home and eat more and get fatter." The China thing, I was listening to Bloomberg Radio out of New York, and they interviewed a Chinese economist, and she said, "We have no property tax in China." Now imagine that, no property tax.
Yeah.
You have the largest migration in the history of the world. They're coming off the farm into the cities in China. And the outskirts of the city, you can buy up property, sit on it for 2 years. You don't pay any property tax. And then some Chinese guy knocks on your door and says, "Oh, I want to build factory here. I give you, however many $1 million he thinks it's worth, and you just sat on it for 2 years and didn't pay. You had no carrying."
Well, that's the whole thing with property that's so upsetting, is that we've convinced ourselves that we need these high taxes so that we can pay for wonderful. In most cases, Bruce, it's going to the education system, and we spend more money in education than any other country in the world, and we're less educated.
Well,
we produce more food than anybody else in the world, and somehow we keep talking about starving people.
We're subsidizing everybody. We're paying farmers not to grow food. We're paying teachers to retire early. We're paying them 100% medical care, which does not encourage them to stay healthy. They'd rather go to the doctor and get a prescription and charge it to the taxpayer than eat healthy food and not have to go to the doctor.
I think it all comes down to when they draft laws, they don't take into account human nature. I mean, they write these laws. If we were all hardworking, industrious people, none of these laws would actually cause a problem.
Well,
But the fact is that there's a good component of people that are being influenced heavily by the aspect of whether or not they can better their lives just by sitting at home.
Well, they're trying to be nice, and the private sector, by not doing anything, the private sector stays home, and they allow the government to run itself. So therefore, they can't find candidates. Again, it comes back to that. You can't find candidates from the private sector, so the government looks to the public sector, and those people run for office. And naturally, a government worker, when they get into government office, they vote to increase the benefits of government workers.
Well, one thing I was proposed to me yesterday, and I agree with, is that we should phase out all types of federal pensions, starting with any elected politician.
I'm thinking that too.
Yeah.
Why should you get a pension just because you have it? I mean, people walk into the government office, whether it be county, state, federal, and they say, "Oh, you got a job for me," and the government gives them a job. There's no risk. They put up no capital. They have a secure job for X amount of years, and then they retire. Now, why should they get a pension? Why not just pay into Social Security like everybody else?
Right. I agree. I think we should not to have an overwhelming effect. Initially, we could eliminate it immediately for every politician. Anybody that's elected to office doesn't get a pension. That's it. They're doing it as a public service, not because they're looking at getting.
Well, that would be nice.
And secondly, they would have that way they wouldn't want to serve for 20 or 30 years, like some of these guys that brag about being in the Senate forever. It's too cushy. And the second thing is that way they can only afford to do it for a few years, 1 term, 2 terms.
Well,
get
that's
in there.
true. If you did it that way, it would force them to get back to their private sector life, and while they're in there, they're going to do everything to favor the private sector.
Right, which they're going to return to shortly. That was the whole idea with the House of Representatives initially, was that these people would be returned to the general population on a regular basis. So they would keep turning them over, and they would
that's almost like jury duty, you know? It's like...
Well, that's the way it should be. That's exactly the way it should be.
I've said that. Why don't we just pick people? But then you say, no matter what you say, there's...
Well, come on, we could have a lottery system and end up with better politicians.
Probably.
Yeah, I mean, just...
but having public sector people... We just had a school board election here in Hamilton. I went to the candidate forum. There were 9 candidates. There was 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, and 3 independents. 1 independent was opposed to the budget and anti-union. All other 8 were pro-union and pro-budget, and they increased the budget by something like $5 million. So the people elected Republicans, but unknowingly, they were all pro-union, pro-budget. At the same time, the voters rejected the school budget.
You know, it's amazing, though. I think we don't realize, and this is what's very scary when you talk to people on the street, there are a lot of people that feel they're getting their little slice from our government, and they don't want to upset the apple cart.
Right.
They think they got a job where they're being paid cash somehow, and they're not paying their taxes. They don't want to see. They're happy with everybody else supporting the system, or they're getting something from the government. They have a relationship with the government. They got a job or contract with the government. They don't want to upset the apple cart. So all the other people are paying for this, and it's a big problem because when it gets
but they're paying for it themselves. They're paying for the other guy. Everybody's paying for everybody else.
But some people like it that way because obviously if people weren't benefiting from it, we wouldn't have this system. Not only is the politician and all of his cronies, I think you mentioned that you called in a couple of weeks ago and you mentioned about a political appointee of Governor Christie, who I've heard very fond things about, but apparently appointed some guy to a $300,000 plus job.
Right, the Port Authority in New York.
Well, Port Authority in New York, I was mentioning that in one of my other programs.
Between Jersey and New York.
That used to be the plum job in the country.
I guess it still is.
Well, because at the time, that's how the U.S. took all its tax dollars was through importation taxes. And so that's where they've got basically funded the entire government. All the revenue came through the ports, and the biggest port was the Port of New York. So that's interesting that still goes on today.
Well, it's an important job, I guess, but $300,000. I mean, that's
a lot. Well, there's an article in USA Today. I think it was USA Today, not to quote because people call that McNews, but yesterday, and they talked about the private the public sector's amount they're getting paid has increased to the highest level in history, and the first time ever, true wages have decreased. I don't know how many quarters in a row now.
Oh yeah, it's almost
sector.
twice as good as the private sector, and their benefits. And the private sector is still too, what's the right word? I don't want to say lazy, but maybe naive, or they just don't have the, they're not PO'd enough yet to realize that we're on a sinking ship. Every policy the government makes is anti-American. It's destroying America. The Chinese have all the benefits. They link their yuan to the dollar arbitrarily at a low rate, which benefits them. So that's one reason why businesses or manufacturers are moving out of this country to China, because they can manufacture stuff cheaper in China and sell it back to the United States. It has to do with the peg of the yuan, plus the low labor costs, the low taxes, everything.
Well, you notice that the American officials are spending a lot of time in China these days. I mean, every time you turn on the news, you see a program, they're over there because they want to make sure the American people keep underwriting the loans and the Chinese keep lending the money, and then where everybody's going to be happy until it all blows up.
All the money that our forefathers made during the Industrial Revolution, when everything was made in America and sold around the world, all that money that came in that we financed World War II with, and we supplied the Russian army with a lot of equipment made in America.
Yeah, I know.
We supplied Western Europe with food. Anyhow, we've lost, and the dollar used to be backed up with gold and silver. Then they dropped that. Then you could say, well, the dollar's backed up with our manufacturing capability because we're pulling in a lot of money. Well, now we've lost that. So now it's not backed up with anything. The Chinese have the dollars.
Well,
we owe them
sadly
money.
it is still backed up by our industry. Our industry meaning our individual industry, our individual efforts.
But that's pretty much
leveraged to the
gone.
max.
I mean, we're in debt to billions of dollars.
So what's the solution, Bruce?
Well, people from the private sector have to get up the gumption or whatever it takes to say, I am going to be a candidate. I mean, like I say, I've tried, and so I've called up the Republicans. I said, look, even the Republicans have a hard time getting candidates. I mean, they're running candidates that they ran last year and the year before, the same candidates, and they're government workers. And if you allow government workers to run and get elected, your private sector is going to be hurt more and more and more. So the private sector has to stand up and say, I will run. Now, whether they run for a third party or whether they run for Republicans or Democrats. In New York, you have this guy. He's a builder. He's putting big ads out on the radio. I hear him. He's an independent. He's running for governor. And he sounds pretty good. He says, hey, I've created a lot of jobs. I'll lower your taxes. But he doesn't say how he's going to lower. You can't keep spending more money and at the same time lower taxes. You have to cut the government.
Yeah, it would seem obvious if you're in business that you have to do that. You either have to increase your income or you have to decrease your expenses, but government doesn't seem to see it that way. And for many years, they've promised to spend more and cut taxes, which, of course, is deficit causing.
And that's our problem. What is our deficit? Our deficit is really money that the government has promised to government workers that the private sector simply does not have. In other words, the private sector is in debt.
They don't even have the money they promised to the private sector. Social Security started getting robbed back in the Johnson administration, and it's a big mess.
We simply cannot, if people are going to, these pensions were all figured way back in the 40s when Social Security was first created. They figured by the time you get to be 60 years old, you're probably going to be dead.
Yeah.
There's a 50-50
well, that's it. They
chance.
use actuary tables that shifted on them, and that isn't entirely. Not that I want to make excuses for them, but the one aspect of that was as understandable as they probably they didn't understand how quickly life expectancy was going to increase.
Yes, it's increased, and that's the problem. The government has come in and decreased their retirement age. So people literally, policemen, they retire at 55. They move out of the Northeast, down south. We're sending money down south, and for 35 years.
Yeah, no, you're right. I know a retired police officer down in Tampa, and he's been collecting for years and years and years and years and years down there. I'm sure he put his time in and so forth, but the problem is the government.
That's irrelevant.
Yeah, but the government is too generous with our money.
Too lenient, too generous, right. They should say, hey, you're retired, great. We don't care where you go. Your pension doesn't start until you're 70 or $1.75, and then we're going to phase it in slowly. We suggest you get a job somewhere.
Yeah.
You know what would happen to the price of labor in this country if these people went out and got jobs? The cost of labor would drop tremendously, and then our taxes would drop, and then industries would move back to the United States because they'd say, hey,
well, that's going to have to happen.
That's going to happen one way or the other, either before we collapse or after we collapse.
Right now, it looks like it's going to happen when the dollar finally collapses, and then it becomes a bargain to move people back in. Bruce, I have to go to break now. I do appreciate your call, and you gave me a lot of great ideas. I hope you'll keep listening today. And
okay, all right, you'll do the rest of the show. Okay, I'll see you.
Thanks, Bruce. Good morning. You're listening to John Federico and Common Sense. We're taking your calls here at 610-664-4100. Our next call comes from Jim in Northeast Philadelphia. Good morning, Jim.
Good morning, John. How are you doing?
Not bad. How are you?
Oh, very well, thanks. Enjoy listening to your show.
Oh, thank you.
Sure. And I appreciate the wide variety of topics that you cover, and like to call in when one in particular I'm interested in discussing. And I think the issue you've been discussing for the last 10 or 15 minutes is one that I've been thinking about lately. And I'm actually more of a glass half full type of perspective on this. I think that in terms of the global economy right now, and as bad as things appear to be, and I think what you're seeing over in the streets of Athens and the Greek contagion that they're talking about and how it could break apart the euro, I think that you see the German government, for instance, the backlash against that for the bailout for Greece.
Sure.
I think for so long, economies like Germany has always been referred to as the sick old man of Europe. And the reason is because of the generous safety nets they had, the social safety nets. And now you see the Germans responding in shock at what's going on in Greece. And they know that it's unsustainable. And they know that the social welfare apparatus, something has to be done about it because it's coming to the point where...
Don't you feel bad for the Germans? They had to go through all that stuff, absorbing the Eastern Germany, managed to pull it off successfully, integrate them into their country, and now they got to deal with Greece. I mean, it seems unfair.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that now it's ironic in a sense that because we've always looked at from over here on our shores, Germany and France in particular is having these social safety nets that are we could never institute in a capitalist economy like ours. But now, as you see more and more, the Germans reacting the way they are and really giving advice to the Greeks to really repair their infrastructure. And
it's funny because it seems like they're going to the hell in a handbasket, and we're anxious to follow their lead.
Well, that's what actually an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday pointed that out. They said it's ironic that as it appears Europe is going to move further away from the social welfare basis, we are in fact turning towards it more and more.
Well, I think I don't know if you read this, but they said the IMF came into Greece and said you have to get rid of some of your health program, something like this, because it's unsustainable. And we basically adopted what they're telling Greece to get rid of. And we pretty much run the IMF. I mean, at least we run a good plurality, if not a majority of it.
Yeah, well, that was another encouraging thing to see the IMF go in there with that type of advice. Usually the IMF's advice is really, we're going to throw billions of dollars your way, just devalue your currency. And, that's our advice.
They couldn't do that because it's the euro, I guess.
That's right. That's right. But, it's still... Nonetheless, it's nice to see that they had some sound advice for once.
It seemed like that the European bailout was backed up by the IMF too, which I guess means we're committing U.S. tax dollars somehow inadvertently to this, right?
Yeah, that's right. And there's been overtones of that. You can parse through the news stories about this, about how much, if indeed we are contributing to this, if we made an overt promise, if it's tough to flesh through and find out the real answer. But I suspect you're correct on that.
So you think it's kind of like Obama's version of the Marshall Plan? But there, I mean, I don't understand how we get wrapped up in such things.
The difference is in the Marshall Plan. I think the money was throwing good money after, potentially good, and it certainly resulted in a good outcome. I think in this case, throwing it after bad.
Because they have to reform, and we were trying to encourage industry and create trading partners at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, we're just subsidizing their social programs, which have been failing for years and are getting worse.
Absolutely correct, John. Absolutely correct.
So, what's the solution, Jim?
Well, I think that this is a wake-up call to, first of all, to the countries in continental Europe that the model they've been running on for the past 4 or 5 decades is unsustainable, especially as the demographics turn against them. I mean, they're facing demographics that are even more serious than we are over here. There are more and more of their workers are older and they're retiring, and plus the retirement age over there. I mean, I think, did you see the other day that France is actually proposing to raise the retirement age? I mean, whoever thought that the French would put a serious proposal forward about raising the retirement age?
I guess the reality dawns on people late. One of the things I always quote Thomas Paine, but in one of his famous remarks, he says that time makes more converts than reason. And so if you can't reason with somebody now, over time, they'll eventually get the idea. And I guess the French are looking at their books and saying, at some point, we have to change something because we can't afford this any longer. Jim, were you a Obama supporter in 2008?
No, I was not. I did vote for McCain.
Were you enthusiastic about it?
Enthusiastic's probably overstating it. But
I'm waiting for my first. I have a lot of people that I know that voted against Obama. I'm still waiting for someone that voted for McCain to call in, but I haven't found anybody.
Oh, you mean voting for Obama?
No, someone that voted for John McCain as opposed to.
Oh, I see, right.
John McCain is the better of two bad choices.
The thing that was frustrating to me about McCain is, from an economic standpoint, I think if we had more, if the Republicans had more of someone who was very much more facile on economic topics and could explain why we needed to avoid some of these prescriptions that the Democrats were bringing forth, I think it could have been a different outcome. I mean,
well, the problem partially was that the Bush administration, and whether you supported them or not, they came forward with this bailout plan initially, which there was reason to believe that we needed to stabilize at that point the banking sector. Certainly, you didn't want it to stem any type of a panic, and there are ways of going about it, but it was a little anti-capitalistic in its overtones to suggest that we're going to put that much public money at the disposal of private industry selected by the government. And so it was kind of hard if you voted for that and you're a Republican. I think they made his life almost impossible if he supported that package. As much as I'm not a big John McCain fan, that was a difficult situation to be in because your own administration, if you're a Republican, was supporting a bailout package. Once he voted for that, I think he lost any type of a conservative base that he might have been able to garner.
That's right, and problems such as GM were kicked down the road for the next administration. You're absolutely right. I think that's a valid criticism of the prior administration.
Yeah, and I think that Bush, he may have meant well, but at the end, he was talked into it by very bright people with connections in the banking industry. And I'm not against banks. I think they're an incredibly important part of our, particularly investment banks, of our culture, our society, and our economics. But you can't let them control the government either. And I think they control it to this day. So anyway, but I appreciate your comments. I'm looking for any type of solution. I guess you're not an independent then, right?
I've really started to think more and more about my frustration level with Republicans, especially on their fiscal policies. At Rose, I was considering more and more about that. I'm still hoping that come November there will be some changes, and that actually the new people that are voted in will adhere to more fiscally conservative, pro-capitalism line than they had been before.
I agree. Of course, the problem with abandoning one party is it leaves you out of the primary fight if you get the vote there. So that's true. That's the only reason why I think it hasn't gotten a larger. Although I think the independents are now at their all-time high, at least for our generation. Well, Jim, I really appreciate your call and your insights.
Well, John, thank you very much.
Appreciate you listening. Thank you, Jim. Okay, well, that was a good call from Jim, and hopefully we'll be able to get, as he says, more fiscally conservative politicians to run and become elected, whether they be independents or Republicans or even Democrats. The idea is not to divide the country by Republican and Democrat or even independent. The focus should be on getting candidates that support the ambitions, the aims, and go to protect the private sector the best we can, instead of providing more and more for a strong, empowered government, which is going to decrease our competitiveness worldwide and make it very difficult for an individual to succeed in our society without the help of government, that is. So that was an interesting call. I appreciated it. I'm going to go to our final break for the hour. You're listening to Common Sense with John Federico at 610-664. Good morning. This is John Federico. You're listening to Common Sense. The number here at the station is 610-664-4100. We're going to move onto our final topic for today. At least I hope it's a final topic for today. For me, it's about immigration. And we were talking a couple times, a couple shows ago, about immigration and ways of making such a mess out of what's really a simple problem. And the reason it's a mess is because politicians don't have the best interest of our country at stake. You see, the country, the politicians, and particularly the president, are supposed to look after the interests of the citizens of the country, not after necessarily the immigrants. You want to be fair to people. You don't want to treat anybody in an abusive manner. However, if someone's breaking the law, you have to enforce the law. And we haven't enforced the law, and we've caused a big problem. But one of the reasons that initially the law wasn't enforced is because it's the way it works is, and I looked this up the other day, is they only allow something like 66,000 work visas to be given out every year. And as the totals come in, I think it's somewhere between 10 and 12 million illegals are here. So I think what probably happened first was we had a visa number of 66,000, and then other people entered in other ways. They either came in as a student visa, they came in as a tourist visa, or they just came in some cases, they didn't need a visa depending on which country they came from, and they decided to stay. In some cases, the student, once they stay past whatever period, maybe it's 6 months or whatever that they're here, or the tourist visa, now they have a choice. If they stay past a certain point, they're now then become illegal, and then if they do leave, they can't come back. So what happens is you have a lot of people that overstayed their visas. These people are not I'm not talking about the Mexicans here, because in most cases these are people that come from far down in South America or over in some parts of Eastern Europe or Russia. And they come here as a tourist visa in many cases, or a student, and then they overstay the visa, and they are part of the illegal immigration problem. Although I think if it were just our immigration problem is really a Mexican problem more than anything else, but because we're on the border with Mexico. And those members come over the border because they can't get the visas, so they come in here illegally. Now, 2 weeks ago, we had a program, and the gentleman I was interviewing suggested, as a good conservative would, that we erect a fence, and we maintain the fence. And I think if you read the news today, you'd see that even the Obama administration is going to be sending, I think it's 1,200 National Guardsmen down to the border to help patrol the border. And that is a very good move. I mean, we need to secure the border. But solving the problem of the people that are in here already, whether we create a visa system for the people that are here illegally, just to have them sign up so we know they're here, they document themselves. We don't make them citizens, but we allow for the fact they're here, and they can pay to stay for a certain period of time or what have you, as long as work is available for them and employer wants to employ them. It would be the same system we have for visas, except it would be one that was more dominated by reason, instead of just by some arbitrary number that they pull out of a hat or out of their butt. So anyway, if you go down to Miami, and I do go down to Miami often, you can't walk down the street without bumping into people that are undocumented. And just like they said in The Untouchables, if you watch that movie, everybody knows where the illegals are, or most of them are, and nobody really wants to collect them and send them back. If they did, they would have already. So the reality is that some of them actually are fundamental to the economy. I'm not saying all 12 million, but if there are 12 million of them here, it stands to reason that at least a couple million of them are necessary for certain aspects of our economy. So They are doing jobs that people wouldn't otherwise do. They are producing product in our country, and some of them. So creating a sensible situation where people can come and go. The last thing I'll say on this topic, last thing I'll expand on this topic is if you had a visa system that was easy where people could come and go as they pleased, as long as they didn't break the law, and as long as to be employed, they got an employer visa, like an HB1, I think it's called, and you made that easy for them, and you expanded that, people wouldn't choose to stay. They would come here, they would work for 6 months or whatever, and they would go home, and they would come back, and they would go home, and they would come back, and they would work, just like we do. If you go to Europe and work, you go there and you do your job. You might be there for 2 days. You fly to Japan for a week for a business conference, and you come back. You don't stay in Japan. The people come to this country because of the opportunity. Now, we're shredding a lot of this opportunity that we used to have, but we're still a very, very, very open society that allows for mobile ability to go from poor to rich, to go from working class to well off through your industry. Government hasn't completely robbed us of that yet, and so it's there for people coming from other countries like Mexico. It's an example of why people want to come to this country, why they're so jealous of America and the way of life that we have here. But if you create a visa system that is sensible, one that we're going to have 3 million visas available. We're going to monitor the people that come. We're going to tax the people that come and work here. And if they do not apply and receive a visa and they're found to be here illegally, then we have to take the necessary steps and remove them. Now, I'm all for building the fence. I'm all for patrolling the border. I'm all for safeguarding Americans along our southeast. It's wrong that government has abandoned its responsibility. I see promising signs that the Obama administration, maybe because there's an election this year, I don't know, but they seem to be, the Democrats are supporting it as well, that we are putting National Guardsmen along the border to shore up our ability to defend our border. So you see this situation get twisted a lot in debate, but I think you have to figure out what caused the problem. And yes, the result is we have a lot of illegal people here, but what caused the problem? And then we should draft sensible resolutions that will take care of the problem. As I spoke on the very first program about squatters' rights, initially it was unlawful for individuals to occupy federal land. This is in the colonial days after the Revolutionary War, and the federal government several times sent troops and removed the squatters. I don't know if they incarcerated them. I don't know the whole story, but I know that they removed them several times, and they would just keep coming back or finding more federal land. Sometimes they would even squat on private land, but it wasn't well staked out. The country was new. There weren't a lot of fences up, and they would just come onto people's land. So the government, did a very practical thing. They kind of threw their hands and said, we can't solve the problem by throwing these people off all the time. Let's create a policy. And they created something called squatters' rights, and they allowed these people to stake claims to federal land. They could delineate the land, and if they started improving and paying taxes on it, they would be entitled to, at a certain point, take ownership of it. Because taking ownership of the land was a fundamental American dream, and that these people, like everybody else, they wanted a place to live and build their homestead and all these things. So it was a really practical solution to a problem, and I think you had a very practical people in the American people. In fact, one of the things, and I don't know if you read, but there was a picture of Dorian Gray with, it was written by Wilder, and at one point he accuses the American people of being too reasonable, because he said they're just so darn reasonable, the Americans, and the British, especially the upper class, were completely impractical in many ways, but the Americans, they're so sensible, they're so reasonable, and it's true. I mean, that was our country's great success, is that we had, in most cases, pretty practical rules, pretty practical laws. When we would adopt laws that weren't practical, it didn't take long for reasonable people to want to overturn those laws. I mean, look at Prohibition. It lasted longer than it should have, perhaps. It was unreasonable to expect that you could completely control drinking in that manner, and it was overturned. Just like I said, Teddy Roosevelt, who a lot of people bash today as being very progressive, even for his day, especially for his day, I should say. When he was police commissioner of New York City, they had a big problem with graft as a result of the prohibition laws of New York. They weren't prohibition, they were blue laws. You couldn't drink on Sunday starting at 12 o'clock Saturday night. And he said, well, the the way to stop a law that's arbitrary and impractical is to enforce the law. You enforce the law across the board, and people will resist it, and then they'll turn around and want to change the law to make it practical and reasonable. If we actually enforced the immigration law when it should have been enforced, it's likely that we would have changed the law a long time ago and been more practical. So we wouldn't have to expend all the money we have to expend now to enforce a law when you have so many people living here illegally. And just because they're illegal doesn't make them, yes, they broke laws, but doesn't make them. They're not all killers. They're not all dangerous people. They're just people trying to make money in our country and either send it home or enjoy it. And it's normal that people would do such a thing. It's wrong that they break the law to do it. But when you don't enforce the law, you encourage the weakening of the law by your non-enforcement. There are a lot of laws in the books today. I'm sure that people are aware. A lot of laws in the books today that are not enforced. Other laws, and when they're not enforced, people pretty much disobey those laws, and they become more or less irrelevant until one day somebody opens a book up and says, "Wait, you can't do this. There's a law." And there are a lot of samples of this. The last thing we talked about with an impractical law, and I bring this up all the time, was that when back in New Jersey had a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, and nobody went 55, so basically people just disregarded the law unless you're the unfortunate fellow and the policeman was in a bad mood and he saw you going 65 or 66 and decided he was going to give you a ticket that day. And your defense, unfortunately, in our country could never be, well, everybody else is doing it, so that could be certainly the defense of the illegal immigrant today, that everyone he knows is doing it, And so in any event, we need more sensible rules. And when you have sensible rules, you'll save a lot of money on compliance, and you will save a lot of frustration, and you'll save a lot of hand-wringing. And maybe the politicians like the hand-wringing. I don't know. They seem to be doing that better than anything else. But sensible rules, uniformly enforced. Figure out what causes a problem before you go to solve it. And do it rationally. Building the fence, again, I support that, but I also support finding a way of dealing with the illegal people that are here and doing it in such a way that is the best interest, not particularly of the illegal immigrant, the best interest of the citizen. If we were to send everybody home today, I think it would be it would be a bad thing for the American citizens. So I'm not suggesting rewarding people that break the law, but I am suggesting that we have a sensible outlook when we go to enforce laws or when we go to write laws. So we're coming to the end of our program. I appreciate you listening today to Common Sense with John Federico. Please listen tomorrow. We'll be on from 10 to 11. Thank you very much.
Does the recession have you down? Are you struggling to make ends meet? Are you tired of watching your retirement plan disappear while the cost of living goes to the roof? Well, great news. You can make 2010 your best money year ever just making a simple change to what you're doing right now. I'm Jim Canale, author of the book Live the Real Estate Lifestyle, and for years I've been teaching people just like you how to use cash flow real estate to solve their money problems forever. Now you can